Many times he says that jihad is an interior spiritual struggle. Now that is something that does exist in Islamic tradition. But when we are speaking about the idea of should Muslim piety be encouraged, should Muslim people be encouraged to be more rigorous and more devout and more fervent in their religious observance, we have to go back to the wellsprings, to the texts and teachings of the Quran and Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, because he is held up in the Quran as chapter 33 verse 21 calls him Uswa Hasana, or the excellent example of conduct. And in Islamic tradition he is even exalted in many places as Al-Insan Al-Kamil, the perfect man. And in practice, in Islamic tradition, even though Muhammad is rebuked several times in the Quran, notably in chapter 80 for his sinfulness, in practice, in Islamic tradition, Muhammad essentially is the touchstone of all behavior. And if he did it, then it's good and right and ought to be imitated. Now that's important for the present question, because when we have the Muslim character saying jihad is an interior spiritual struggle, he is in fact actually putting himself in the position of contradicting the words and example of Muhammad and the words of the Quran itself. There's an entire chapter of the Quran, chapter 8, called Al-Anfal, the spoils of war. There are no spoils of war in an interior spiritual struggle. There's no booty to be captured, there are no slave girls to be distributed among the warriors, and yet that chapter of the Quran and others actually contains instructions for doing just that kind of thing. And a fifth of the spoils are reserved for the Prophet himself. He took part in these wars. He fought actually 78 battles during his career as a prophet, and 77 were offensive in nature. The Quran does not teach that jihad is its interior spiritual struggle. The Quran almost unanimously, when it speaks of jihad, when it uses the Arabic word jihad in its various forms, which means struggle, and of course struggle in Arabic has just as many connotations as struggle does in English. You can struggle to quit smoking or to lose weight. You can struggle against communism or have states struggling against one another. So it is also in Islam. But the primary meaning of the word jihad in the Quran is unmistakably warfare. And the Muslim hero of Dr. Critic's book further says that Muhammad never fought against Christians and Jews unless he did so in a defensive manner. That unfortunately is also factually false. As a matter of fact, the last battle of his career, right before he died, Muhammad went to Tabuk, which was an outpost, a Byzantine imperial outpost in northern Arabia or southern Syria, depending on where you want to put the border. And he went to fight a Christian garrison there of the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire. He didn't actually find them there. They left, whether they left in order to avoid fighting him, or whether they left because they didn't know he was coming and didn't care and left for their own reasons, we don't know. In any case, he was not able to fight them. But unfortunately, he left in chapter 9 of the Quran numerous teachings, which of course are all conveyed as divine revelation that cannot be questioned and has to be obeyed by any pious and observant Muslim. He left instructions to wage offensive warfare against Jews and Christians, particularly in chapter 9 verse 29, which tells Muslims to fight against those who do not obey Allah and His Messenger and do not forbid what He has forbidden. In other words, they don't follow the strictures of Islamic law, even if they are of the people of the book, which is the Quranic designation primarily for Jews and Christians, until they pay the jizya, which is a tax, that's what the word means in Arabic, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. That verse became the foundation for an elaborate superstructure of laws that are still part of Islamic jurisprudence. They are still part of Islamic political law that Islamists, that jihad terrorists, and that any Islamic supremacist wants to impose over the world today. These laws mandate that non-Muslims of the people of the book must pay a special tax from which Muslims are exempt. As a matter of fact, you can pretty much correlate in Islamic history the strength and the aggression and the rise of the great Islamic empires of the past with the size of the Jewish and Christian communities that were subjugated within those empires and were paying for that imperial expansion. When those communities were exhausted economically, then the Islamic empires went into decline. This is an absolute correlation that recurs again and again and again. The Christians and Jews in Muslim lands were subjugated in accord with that section of the verse, the last part, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. They never enjoyed equality of rights with Muslims. They were denied the right to build new houses of worship or to repair old ones. They were denied the right to hold authority over Muslims, so that Jews and Christians were relegated to the most menial and degrading jobs in the society. They were subject to various other humiliating and discriminatory regulations. Now, this is, as I say, I cannot emphasize enough, still part of Islamic law. This is not one sect or one school or one group that's heretical that has made this part of their teaching. This is universal among all the sects and the schools of jurisprudence that are recognized as mainstream and orthodox by fellow Muslims. They all teach that you cannot find one that does not teach the necessity to wage war against unbelievers, to subjugate them under the rule of Islamic law. And they are working. As a matter of fact, Hamas in Gaza has announced its intention to, once it's fully consolidated its power, to impose that system of dimitude and subjugate the Christians that remain there under its institutionalized forms of discrimination. Gangs in Baghdad, they did not have governing authority, to be sure, but they terrorized the Christian community, which, as I'm sure you know, is terrorized on a more or less daily basis. And there was just another massacre in a church the other day. They were knocking on doors in Baghdad last year and demanding payment of the jizya, this tax, which was essentially, it amounts to protection money, that you pay it and then you don't get killed. But you don't pay it, or you transgress some of the other laws that are set out for these subjugated peoples, and then your life is forfeit. These things are still part of the agenda for Islamic jihadists today. The Islamic jihadists, coming back to the thesis, the question being debated here tonight, Islamic jihadists routinely portray themselves within the Muslim communities worldwide and among peaceful Muslims as being the most pious, most observant, in other words, best Muslims available. They are, in other words, the Muslims who present themselves as being the true, the pure Muslims. As a matter of fact, the worldwide Salafi movement, that's what it's all dedicated to, is restoring the purity of Islam as they see it. Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, founded the Brotherhood in 1928 after Kemal Ataturk abolished the caliphate, which was the supranational symbol of the unity, the supranational unity of the Muslims that transcended all national boundaries. Ataturk abolished the caliphate in 1924. Hassan al-Banna established the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928 in Egypt as a direct reaction to the abolition of the caliphate, because he believed that without the political aspects of Islam that have never been considered to be separable from the religious individual aspects of spiritual observance in any Islamic tradition, that those without the political aspect of Islam that had been damaged by the abolition of the caliphate, Islam was not being fully observed in the world. And he dedicated the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the direct forefather of Hamas and Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, as well as many pseudo-moderate groups in the United States today, like the Council on American Islamic Relations and so on. He was dedicating it to restoring what he saw as the fullness of Islamic observance, as the true observance of Islamic piety, which involved the subjugation of unbelievers, violence against them if they resisted, and the establishment of Muslims as a special class who would enjoy rights that the other groups in the society did not enjoy. These things are represented around the world today, in the Islamic world, in Muslim communities in the West as well, as being part of what it means to be a good Muslim. They make their appeal to peaceful Muslims. They justify their own actions of terror or supremacism, and they make recruits among peaceful Muslims by representing themselves as being the embodiment of authentic Muslim observance. Now, obviously, there are Muslims who do not consider that acts of terrorism or violence, or the supremacist attempts to impose Islamic law over non-Muslims, they don't believe that that is part of their Islamic piety. And certainly I applaud them, and I wish there were more of them insofar as they're sincere. They are, however, universally, worldwide, on the defensive today. They are represented as the bad Muslims by their fellow Muslims, who are pointing to the texts of the Koran and the teachings of Muhammad to portray themselves as being the ones who are in the right. And so the Muslims who we could look to with hopes of reform, the Muslims who we would look to with hopes of their being our allies, they are the ones who are considered to be the bad Muslims, generally in the Islamic community. And it must also further be stated, unfortunately, that there is no theological system in Islam, there is no sect, there is no group within Islam that has formulated a comeback, an understanding, a construction of Islamic theology based on the Quran that makes a case to reject violence and supremacism and the subjugation of unbelievers. It doesn't exist. There are many individuals who are working against it, but there is no group that we can point to and say, ah, they're the ones we need to work with. In other words, they have not formulated any kind of convincing comeback. The texts are not on their side. There are peaceful, pacifistic texts in the Quran. Dr. Critic quotes many of them in his book. He does not, unfortunately, quote the violent ones to which I alluded before, and I mentioned one of them specifically. Another one, for example, is chapter 8, verse 60, part of that Al-Anfal, Spoils of War chapter, that directs Muslims to strike terror into the hearts of the enemies of Allah. Now you can say, well, that doesn't have to do with modern terrorism. That's terror in a much broader sense. But unfortunately, modern terrorists can and do point to that verse and say, that's what we're doing. That's why we're doing what we're doing. We're striking terror into the hearts of the enemies of Allah. The peaceful passages, according to mainstream Islamic theologians, and to the preponderance of Islamic theological tradition, do not take precedence over the violent passages. The peaceful passages generally were revealed earlier in Muhammad's career. He was a prophet for 23 years. Over those 23 years, he received revelations from God, which were collected in the Quran. Early in his career, when he was in Mecca, he had a small band of followers facing a very powerful pagan Arab establishment of his own tribe, the Quraysh, in Mecca. That's when he was saying, say to the unbelievers, you have your religion and we have ours. You don't worship what we worship, and we don't worship what you worship, and essentially let's just leave each other alone. That's chapter 109 of the Quran. The unfortunate fact is that when he later moved in the Hijra, or the Hijra to Medina, and became for the first time a political and military leader, the tenor of the Quranic revelations began to change. And the violence began to be taught and began to be carried out by Muhammad himself. Now, mainstream Islamic theologians and the preponderance of Islamic theological tradition teaches that if there is a disagreement between two passages in the Quran, then one of the chief ways to understand which one takes precedence for our own day is which one came later chronologically in Muhammad's career. Unfortunately for us, the violence comes later, and thus is considered under the principle of al-nasikh wal-mansukh, or abrogation, to have been cancelled, to cancel out the peaceful passages. Or the peaceful passages only apply when Muslims are a small group, like the Meccan Muslims were in the first stage of Muhammad's career. So in other words, they're a small group, they're powerless, then they teach tolerance and nonviolence. But later, gaining power, gaining in numbers, the other parts begin to kick in. And you have the violence and the supremacism begin to apply.